Welcome back to Archie's Acres, the VSAT program. This lecture is going to be on an overview of plant nutrition. First thing, it's important to know that all organic matter is comprised of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. The 90% of the plant's dry weight is made up of those four components alone. With that said, the majority of the plant weight and the plant as a whole is made up of water. When you put a plant in the sun and let it dry out completely, there's very little dry weight left over. But out of that dry weight that's left over, 90% of it is made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And what this graph shows you here is how much of the Earth's atmosphere is actually comprised of what I really want to point out is the nitrogen. You see the biggest chunk on there, the vast majority of our atmosphere is comprised of nitrogen gas. And as an organic grower, nitrogen is one of the most difficult things to get to my crop is to solubilize nitrogen. Unfortunate thing about atmospheric gases and nitrogen is that it's not in form that the plants can consume. Now there is bacteria that can fix atmospheric nitrogen into a form, in a solubilized form that the plant can intake. But alone, the plant can't take in atmospheric nitrogen. Everything living is considered organic, and the byproduct of living organisms is also considered organic. Now, in the past, this has created some discrepancy between the United States Department of Agriculture's definition of organic and our European, Canadian, Japanese, and other countries' definition of organic. In the past, the USDA said because by definition any byproduct of an animal or plant is considered organic, you can use that on an organic operation even though it's not a certified organic farm where you're getting that organic matter from. Where other European countries and Canadian and Japan said an organic farm has to derive their inputs from or other certified organic sources. Many United States organic certifiers have kept their growers to that same standard as well. So even though USDA said you can be a certified organic farm but use cow manure from a non-certified organic farmer because cow manure by definition is considered organic, many certifiers in the United States said we want to be sure that you're also using manures and so forth from a certified organic farm. And to meet compliance to distribute your products outside the United States, you need to meet those requirements. Things have changed a little bit. They now have a organic compliance to open up global markets for United States organic, certified organic products. But just know there's sometimes those discrepancies out there between that definition of organic. Plants can access the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen from either the water or the atmosphere, so they don't need to be supplied with those in the form of like a fertilizer, or you don't need to supply those manually. Simply watering and access to atmosphere is going to supply that to the plant as well. But they use those as well as light to help produce photosynthesis. So in terms of fertilizers, when we do need to apply fertilization and nutrients to the plant, in the hydroponic industry, most fertilizers are highly concentrated and the compounds themselves are somewhat unstable. So they typically come in like a 2 or 3 part formula. So most of our hydroponic formulas on the synthetic side, synthetically derived hydroponic formulas and fertilizers either come in 2 or 3 parts. And that's because the compounds somewhat are unstable, and sometimes you mix them together, they change what value they can add to your crop. An instance is this 2 products right here, Sensei Bloom from Advanced Nutrients. You see there's an A formula and a B formula. So in a hydroponic system, when we fill up our reservoir with water and we're ready to add our nutrients, you add the A formula, mix it in the water, these compounds will bind to the water, and then you mix in the B formulas. If you add these together at the same time, again, it may change the value because they're somewhat unstable. Now we have a series of slides that's going to go through each each nutrient the plant deals with in detail. I'm going to skip through most of this. If you want to refer to some of these nutrients in more detail, go ahead and open up the PowerPoint in the website, in the alumni or student group under file sharing. You can look at these slides in a little more detail. We're going to pass through these pretty quickly. Carbon occurs in the cell's walls, and sugars manufactured by chlorophyll. Hydrogen, oxygen, again nitrogen, formation of amino acids, coenzymes, and chlorophyll. So again, looking at a plant, if you see the plant begin to yellow on the younger tissue first, a lot of times it's a sign of lack of nitrogen because it doesn't have enough nitrogen to produce chlorophyll, and that's the easy sign of lack of nitrogen. So again, the macronutrients, the primary macronutrients that we have to supply that's not supplied by water to the atmosphere is the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Again, it's a sign of lack of nitrogen. It's typically yellowing of the leaves. Phosphorus, production of sugars. Potassium is important for protein synthesis and also helps harden your crop and helps develop your root growth as well. Other micronutrients that plants use on smaller scale, although they use them on a much smaller scale, doesn't mean they're not important. If we want to focus on maximizing a crop's production, encouraging great flavors, encouraging a nutritious product for our consumers to have, we have to supply all of these nutrients in adequate levels. A lack of any one of these means we won't be able to maximize our crop's potential. Other macronutrients include calcium, required for cell wall formation. It's easy to have a lack of calcium, particularly in the summertime when heat is high and you're growing tomatoes, for instance, and so you have a tomatoes full crop and then it gets very warm. A lack of nitrogen will give you tip burn, so you get this burn on the end of the leaves and you get these scabs in your bottom of the fruit. If you see those, it's calcium, calcium deficiency. And you can see here it's because calcium is required to help build up our cell walls. You can also use calcium if you have salty water to help protect your tissue from being burned due to salty water. Sulfur, iron, magnesium, boron, manganese, zinc, molybdenum. And one thing I want to point out, and this is true with many of these, if you have a deficiency of one, it may mean another nutrient isn't being metabolized properly. And if you have an excess of one or toxicity of one, it may mean the same thing. So for instance, molybdenum helps metabolize and fix nitrogen. So if you have a molybdenum deficiency, you may see in your crop an actual nitrogen deficiency because the crop can't produce or can't metabolize the nitrogen efficiently without the molybdenum. So the point is, as opposed to looking at a crop saying I have a nitrogen deficiency, so let me add nitrogen, do a tissue sample so you can really see what am I lacking. Maybe it is just lack of nitrogen, you have to supply more nitrogen. Maybe it's a lack of molybdenum, you have to supply molybdenum so it can properly metabolize the nitrogen. Copper, and although cobalt isn't known to be directly required by the plants, it helps the microorganisms that help us fix nitrogen. So we like to see that as one of the requirements for good organic crop production. Going back to our hydroponic formulas, again, most of them are two-part. The nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, again, NPK has to be labeled on all fertilizer bottles. You see, going back to our two-part formula right here, part A, and you see on the front, you also see on the back, 404, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So this bottle has 4% nitrogen, 0% phosphorus, and 4% potassium. Again, that's how you read the nutrient bottles, and that's how you, and all fertilizers for that matter, dry or liquid, and that's how you can understand what's going on and what the value of that nutrient or fertilizer is. Fertilizers that are designed for soils don't always run well in hydroponic systems, all right? Now some do, but particularly on the organic side, some liquid and dry fertilizers that are designed for soils don't necessarily run well in hydroponic systems because of lack of metabolism, or the case may be. Just keep that in mind. The other thing about hydroponics is we need complete fertilizers. So the thing about soils is soils naturally provide some and many of your micronutrients, where hydroponic systems don't. So many of the fertilizers designed for soil applications leave out the micronutrient aspect because they assume the soil is going to provide it. Where in hydroponics, we need not only those macronutrients, we need the micronutrients as well. So hydroponic specific formulas were designed with that in mind because they know the soils in the hydroponic system is lacking, and so we need to supply the value that the soils typically would provide, which is usually as micronutrients. And different crops may need different levels of nutrients in different crops, and crops will change their nutrient demand through various stages of the life cycle. All right, for instance, kale. People love kale because it's very nutrient dense. Well, guess what that means? When you're growing kale, it has a much higher nutrient and fertilization demand than something like lettuce, which is primarily water weight, very light in terms of feeding it with nutrients while it's growing, and it doesn't have a whole lot of nutrient value to the end consumer. So just going back to different crops need different levels of nutrients and at different times of the crop cycle. So good nutritional needs: oxygen, CO2. Again, CO2 for the plant is like oxygen for us. We breathe in oxygen, exhale CO2. Plant tissue does the exact opposite. It breathes in CO2 and exhales fresh oxygen for us. We need water. We need light, and the macro as well as micronutrients. All right, pH. pH is a measure of hydronium ion concentration. We're not going to get into a whole lot what that means. More importantly, I want you guys to be able to understand how to read pH and what is taking place when pH changes. Every time nutrient passes through the root zone in hydroponic systems, right, we typically have water passing through our root system. An exchange is taking place, right? And nutrients and oxygen and gases are being exchanged. And pH can affect what is being exchanged, right? pH is measured on a scale from 0 to 14, 1 being an acid, 14 being alkaline, all right? So the lower the number, the more acidic; higher the number, the more alkaline or basic it is. Pure water should be 7.0. 7.0 is neutral, all right? Now, when a hydroponic reservoir, when we're using, let's stick with synthetics for a while, when we're using synthetic nutrients, we add our nutrients to the water. Now, a lot of water, plants like their pH at about 6.5, and it can vary. Again, blueberries like it more acidic, around 4.5. Most crops like it around 6 to 6.5 range. Very rarely is water coming out of the tap or a water source at 6.5 pH. Usually it's higher, sometimes lower, where the case may be. Most of the water we deal with here at Arches Acres is typically around 7 to 7.5 when it comes out of the tap. And then you put your nutrients on it, and that can change the acidity of the water as well. So on the synthetic side, we can use what they call buffers to get our pH in optimal range, meaning if our pH after we add our nutrients is at 7.0, we want to get it down to 6 to 6.5 so it can be in that optimal range for the plant. You can use what they call a pH downer. It's an acidic buffer. You add it very slowly to the water that can lower your pH. Now these are very concentrated, so what we typically do is we'll take an eyedropper, put a few drops of the buffer in a small container of water, mix it around, and then add that to the reservoir, mix it in really well, let it settle for a couple minutes, measure the pH, see what pops up, and then continue to adjust as well. And what you definitely don't want to do is, let's say you start off with water at 7.0 and you add too much pH downer and it drops your water down to 4.0, and then you're using a pH upper to try to get back up into the 6 to 6.5 range. Very slowly lower your water pH in increments to where it gets down to the optimal range as opposed to jumping up and down, as that may have adverse effects. And this is why pH is so important. If you look at this chart, it shows you the different nutrients the plants require and different pH ranges that the plant prefers to be in, and what nutrients are available at that range. As you can see here in the 6 to 6.5, is a good availability of almost all the nutrients. As you go more alkaline, some of these nutrients become more available or less available, and you become more acidic. The same thing that takes place. Most crops, though, again, are in the 6 to 6.5 range of preferred acidity, and this is a good level where all the most of the nutrients have very good availability. Okay, so that's pH. Now let's talk about TDS, total dissolved solids, right? In the hydroponic systems, it's the matter in the water that's passing through our root zone that provides nutrients to the plants, right? So there's tools that we can use to measure what's in that water and give us an idea of what's the value to the crop of that nutrient solution. And there's two terms we use to measure total dissolved solids. Again, total dissolved solids refers to how much solids are dissolved in the water that the crop can potentially have access to. Two ways to measure that: parts per million and electrical conductivity. All right, now parts per million really have to do in a lab. You extract the water, you measure how much dry matter is left behind separated from the H2O, and you can measure there's X amount of dry parts to 1 million parts of water. We don't do this on the farm typically, unless you are probably a more established farm and have that type of gear, and I'm not sure why you would. Typically, how we measure total dissolved solids on a farm is through EC, and we use a pen similar to this one. I like this pen because it separates the pH pen, which is this guy right here, from the EC pen. Now, many pens will have this combined. The problem is pH pens will go bad on you after some time. This pen will allow you to replace just your pH side of the probe as opposed to replacing the whole meter itself. So this is the pH pen. You can tell a pH pen because if you look on the end of the pH pen, it's kind of a round globe looking thing. That identifies the pH side. You stick that in the water, hold it there for a few seconds, and it'll shoot you out a pH, the pH of your water. This is how we measure total dissolved solids. And the other side of the pen is the TDS side of the pen. If you look in here, you can kind of see two black dots. Can you see those? Now, not all pens are like this one. Usually pens have two rods exposed. What those two dots inside that pen are two rods that point out, and they are essentially 1 centimeter in space apart. And what they do, these rods, is shoot a small electrical current between each other. The longer it takes for that electrical current to get between the two rods, the more dissolved solids in the water, right? That's how we can measure total dissolved solids using a pen like this, through EC. Now what happens in the US is the term parts per million has become commonly used. Now we can't measure true parts per million with a pen like this, but what they did was they said, okay, in the US, we could take the EC, we could times it by 500, and we'll call that parts per million. And it gets even crazier because when you go to Europe and other countries, they take the EC, they times it by 700, and they call that parts per million. So when we're using a pen like this one here, and we refer to parts per million, which is the common term, it's really a reference of the EC. If you're using a pen like this and you're reading in parts per million, it says 1500 parts per million, you can divide that by 500 and you'll get you'll get an EC of 3, depending on the unit of measure of EC. It's a metric measure, so sometimes it could be 3,000, or it can just be 3, depending on the metric of measure. Decisiemens per meter, or whatever the case may be. So that's how I measure total dissolved solids. Now, why is total dissolved solids in your water important? For a couple reasons. First, let's talk about the use of synthetic fertilizers in the hydroponic system. If we're using pure water and we use synthetic nutrients like these here, which are pure salts, when I take my water and I put a pen like this and it's pure H2O, Let's say we use a reverse osmosis filtration system, which will separate all the salts out of the water. I should be able to put this pin in that water at that point and read 0 parts per million or EC, or very, very, very close to it. So when I add my salts here, and I put the pin back in the reservoir, and it shoots out 1,000 parts per million or 1,200 parts per million, what that's telling me is truly how much salt is in the water. And as the salt drops, that means I need to add more, and if it's too high, it means I need to add more water to keep it down a little bit. And these companies are very good at telling you exactly what your EC or parts per million should be when you apply it to your system for maximized results. Now, how we do this is, you may not have a reverse osmosis system. If you're a commercial grower, you're probably not going to use reverse osmosis system because it's cost prohibitive to run those type of systems. So what you want to do before adding any type of fertilizer to your water is measure the TDS of your water with nothing in it, right? So if you measure your TDS of water and the TDS of pure, let's say pure tap water equals 500 parts per million, all right? And this fertilizer company is saying the parts per million should be 1,000 when you add this to your reservoir. They're assuming your water is at 0, all right? So if your water is actually 500 parts per million coming out of the tap, and they're telling you should be at 1,000 parts per million when you add that to your reservoir, what this really means is you want to add 1,000 parts per million to that 500 to give you a total of 1,500 parts per million when it's added properly. All right, so you always want to know what your TDS is of the pure water reservoir before adding a fertilizer. If you're using a reverse osmosis system and this is 0 and that company tells you it should be at 1,000, then at the end of the day, you should be at 1,000 parts per million. How is this different with organics? The thing with organics is we don't necessarily have pure salts in organics. Right here at Archie's Acres, we use a compost tea. So we have salts in there, but we also have just floating organic matter, floating guano droppings, and whatever the case may be in the water. So when we measure our EC, or our parts per million, with a pin, when running an organic system, it doesn't tell us how much salts are in there, it just gives us reference numbers. And over time, if we track these reference numbers, then we can start to develop the story of what's going on in our system when we add nutrients and so forth. For example, what's typical for our system is we typically add teas twice a week, all right? Friday we add tea. What we find is when we add tea on Friday, our pH rises. It goes above 7.0. As a few days go by, the microorganisms in our biofilters and in our water digest the metabolize that insoluble nitrogen and releases ammonium nitrates, which are more acidic. So then we see our pH start to climb back down as that nitrogen becomes available. So after a couple of days, where we started off at 7.2, now we're down at 5.8, 5.7, and then as you get closer to the restocking time of a reservoir, if we put more tea in, the pH starts climbing back up because the nitrogen has been used up and it needs to be restocked, all right? So we didn't know that the first time we started running the system was when we dropped a pH pin. It takes time for us to develop that story using the total dissolved solids and measuring the EC and the pH and putting that all together, measuring the performance of a crop. You do all that, tells you the story of what's taking place and if you're on track or not. So that's the difference between an organic system and a synthetic system. When you're measuring a synthetic system, you're measuring how much true salts are in the system. In an organic system, you're trying to write a story of what's taking place within it. Typically, pH and total dissolved solids have a proportional relationship. For instance, and this is definitely true in an organic system, that if the system has the right access to nutrients, the microorganisms are going to balance your pH for you, right? And that's kind of what this graph shows you. You see our parts per million is within range and our pH system is good, or our pH range is good as well, all right? So we've applied adequate amount of nutrients and it helped us balance out our pH. Now, looking at this graph, we see our parts per million climb and our pH drop. Now, what causes this? Well, there are several things that cause it, but here we see this taking place in the winter months predominantly. In the summer months predominantly. The parts per million climb and the pH drops. The reason why the parts per million climb in the summer is because our crop is using more water, right? The transpiration rate is greater because of warmer weather, so the plant essentially sweats more, the transpiration rate is much greater. And so it's leaving behind more solids, right? It's using more water. And so if you're not resupplying that water on a constant basis, you're going to notice your parts per million begin to climb because of lack H2O, so those the nutrients in the reservoir become more concentrated. And oftentimes that'll cause your pH to begin to drop. And on the reverse end, on this graph, you have our parts per million, our pH rise while our parts per million drop. And we see this in our wintertime. Transpiration rate slows down because it's cooler, right? So the plants are using more nutrients than they were in proportion to the water. So the water becomes more diluted as the plant takes the nutrients out of the water. And oftentimes that can cause our pH to rise because of lack of nutrients. Microbiology and water. All bodies of water are home to microbiology. Now, this is bad for municipalities who want to supply fresh drinking water to households, right? And that's why many municipalities use chlorine, because they want to kill off any biology that could be in the system, because not all biology is good biology. But in a hydroponic system, chlorine is bad for us, and good microbiology is very good for our crop system. An organic hydroponic system, like in organic soils, we cannot operate efficiently without the help of microorganisms. They help clean our system, they help metabolize our nitrogen and other nutrients, they help regulate our pH, they defend our crop from diseases and so forth. So our goal is to create a favorable environment that will become the home to beneficial microorganisms. Again, that's a rich, an environment that's rich in oxygen, temperatures within range, and adequate supply of nutrients being supplied. Again, warm water holds less dissolved oxygen than cooler water. We like to keep our reservoirs in the 70-degree range and 80-degree range. Now we're growing basil, and basil is a warmer weather crop, so it prefers warmer water in the root zone. In fact, we talk to a lot of basil aficionados who are growing in soils. They'll even water their basil in the soils with warm water because that's what the basil prefers. So in the summertime, we can allow our reservoirs to get up to about 90 degrees. After 90 degrees, you start seeing burn on the crop. Other crops are different though. If you try to grow lettuce with a reservoir temperature in the 80s, it'll probably just go to wilt and shut down. All right, so you're gonna have to figure out ways to keep it cool. Now, how can we regulate the temperature of our water and ensure that's not too hot that we're dissolving our oxygen? It's gonna kill off our crop, and ensure it's not so cold that our cell division stops. We quit getting growth rates. There's a couple ways to do this. On the cool side, the only way you can really do it is probably by applying heat through either heat rods, what we use. We have this large rod that's in the bottom of our tank that supply heat, titanium or steel, stainless steel rods. Also heating the greenhouse. If you're in a greenhouse, we'll also heat the water. So there's not a whole lot of options other than supplying energy to heat the water. To cool the water, one thing you could do if you live in a hot region, use a larger reservoir. The larger reservoir means the less amount of time the water from the reservoir is going to spend in the system. It's usually in the system like an NFT, which is where the water heats up. So if you have a larger reservoir, and our reservoirs we try to put underground as far as possible because the ground can help regulate temperature as well. A larger reservoir will tend to stay a bit cooler in hotter temperatures than a smaller reservoir will. You can also use what they call a cooling tower. I've seen these used in Australia. How a cooling tower works is you'll have a reservoir of water down here. This is our reservoir of water. They'll build these H-shaped towers that will rise, 30 feet or so. And what they do is they'll pump the water up these towers and then let the water fall down. All right. And as the water falls down, it creates evaporation within these tubes. And these are built out of PVC, so it's all enclosed. But as the water falls down, this waterfall effect, two things happen. One, it's exposed to air. So oxygen is dissolved in the water as the water falls. And two, some of that water evaporates. Evaporation uses a large amount of energy. And when that energy is used, it drops the temperature of the water. So it does two things for us. Again, hot water is bad because A, it can burn our crop, and B, it has less dissolved oxygen. A cooling tower, A, helps us cool the water, and B, helps enrich it with oxygen as well. Again, plants intake CO2 and exhale O2. All right, plants intake carbon dioxide, exhale oxygen. Natural air contains approximately 2% carbon dioxide. You can measure this in parts per million as well. You can get meters that you can put in with your crop that'll measure CO2. CO2 is a needed element to growing crops. If you have an overly rich atmospheric environment, which can happen in a greenhouse, and not enough CO2, it will affect your growth rates. So there's a couple things you can do with that. One, you can buy CO2 regulators, and you can buy canisters full of CO2, or buy CO2 generators. It's typically run off propane or natural gas, and you can supply artificial CO2. But most of the crops we're growing, herbs, produce, vegetables, and so forth, buying in supplemental CO2 is going to be too expensive to be justified. So we want to use more natural ways. So the best way to do that in a greenhouse environment is just ensuring that we're exchanging the inside air with the outside air periodically. Get the fresh air into the greenhouse and the old air out of the greenhouse and make sure we're getting in some fresh CO2. There's you can potentially use heaters if you have propane or natural gas heaters. You can potentially use the exhaust from those heaters to supply CO2 into the greenhouse. You got to be very careful though, depending on law in your area, as well as whether or not you're going to have employees working in that area or yourself. It may create an environment that's very unsafe, and we don't want to encourage that. But there has been some pretty innovative solutions to implementing high rates of CO2 in greenhouse as well. I read about one greenhouse operation somewhere in the Midwest that was built on a farm that neighbored a factory that produced a lot of CO2. They made a deal with that factory where they pumped their CO2 over into the greenhouse. The grower got free CO2, which helped increase his growth rates, and that factory got carbon offsets because they're disposing properly of their CO2. So it was a win-win situation. I don't know a whole lot of those opportunities out there, but it's just something to think about. So the rule of thumb in a growing environment is to exchange the air once every hour if you're not providing supplemental CO2. Get fresh air in there every hour to ensure there's CO2 in the area. Now, if you're in a Quonset style greenhouse, that's a very large cavity in that greenhouse. So don't be worried about exchanging air every hour, but it is probably something you want to do on a daily basis, is exchange that air in a greenhouse. And you could do so by, in a greenhouse, we do this by either roll-up walls or exhaust fans. If you're converting a warehouse or something like that, you're going to need to use something like blowers to clean that, to cycle that air. Blowers operate in terms of cubic feet per minute. This is what a blower looks like. This blower, the blower itself, is this gray canister on the right here. This is actually attached to a carbon filter. Now, carbon filters are primarily used by kids growing in their closets, where the case may be, because they take out smell. But carbon filters are great for ensuring that the air coming into your growing environment is sanitized. So these are lined with carbon If you're in the military, you might have used a MOPP suit at one point in your time. Your MOPP suit is lined with carbon as well because it absorbs toxicity that may kill you. These basically do the same thing. So if you're trying to exchange air, let's say in a warehouse, this is a great system not only to exchange that air, but also to ensure that the air that's coming in is purified and free of disease-causing pathogens. So in summary, 17 essential plant nutrients. We want a pH for most crops from 6 to 6.5. With organics, if we have the right supply of nutrients and a healthy environment, our microorganisms will help us regulate that pH on its own. We won't have to do anything. But on the synthetic side, you may need, depending on your water as well as the nutrients you're using, you probably need to use pH buffers, both uppers and downers, to get the pH in range. A deficiency of even one of those 17 essential nutrients can show, and if you have a deficiency of one of those, it means you can't focus on better growth rates, you can't focus on flavors or better appeal or anything like that. You have to make sure all 17 are in place at adequate levels. Microbiology is a cornerstone of organic crop production, but it doesn't mean it should be absent in synthetics. In fact, more and more conventional farmers, both on the hydroponic side and soil-borne side, are incorporating more what typically be conceived of organic techniques like harnessing certain microbiology, incorporating organic matter and so forth, because it plays a role and can benefit synthetic growers as well. Commercially available nutrients are easy and very accurate to use. On the synthetic side, they're very cheap too. You get very high grade, like these nutrients here, very high grade nutrients, pharmaceutical grade, that produces amazing crop, very nutritious, and even though they're synthetic, because they're in a closed loop hydroponic system, have no detrimental effect on the environment. On the organic side, not a whole lot of commercial available nutrients for hydroponic growers. More and more are becoming available, but it's still a small portion of the industry at this point. We like organics because it's something that me and my wife believe in personally, but it's also our niche. Organic agriculture is still very much a niche, although it's growing rapidly, and it's something that separates us from our neighboring farms and helps us give us a niche in a marketplace. And you may find that may be true with you as well. Supplemental CO2 can play a role, but it can be expensive. So the way to get out of supplemental CO2 is ensuring that we have an exchange of air. Again, in a grow room environment, every hour. In a greenhouse environment, we probably want to do that on a daily basis. Exchange that air, flush out that waste oxygen, and fill it with some air that has adequate levels of CO2. And that's it for now.